everyone. Welcome to the Sanctum Secorum podcast, where we plumb the depths of Appendix N as it pertains to the Dungeon Crawl Classics role-playing game. We're back, and we are here to help you serve these literary offerings at your DCC RPG table. I am Keeper Jen. Had to remember what show I was on, sorry.
Oh, it's going to be like that.
It's been a really long week. We're in the weekend into Gen Con, you know, brain cells. With us, we have the wonderful Keeper Marc.
Hey, everyone. I brought a special guest.
And Keeper Bob.
Hey, everyone, I'm still reeling from Rules as Written earlier today, but glad to be here.
I missed it. Did you get rules handed to you? Or
no, it was just we spent quite a bit of time discussing Mutant Crawl Classics, and since the Sanctum Secorum library has been relocated, I have not yet found my MCC film.
Versus. Well, we're getting there. Tonight, however, we had a slow-burning piece of modern horror, if you want to call it, what was it, 1960?
77.
Yeah.
Oh, was it? About as modern as we are then. But the author is no stranger to Sanctum Secorum. He is an acknowledged grandmaster of fantasy, and we're talking, of course, of Fritz Lieber. We are going to be diving into the semi-autobiographical tale, Our Lady of Darkness. Take it away, Bob.
Middle-aged San Francisco horror writer Franz Weston is rediscovering ordinary life following a long alcoholic binge. Then, one day, peering at his apartment window from atop a nearby hill, he sees a pale brown thing lean out his window and wave. The encounter sends Weston on a quest through ancient books and modern streets for the dark forces and paramental entities that thrive amidst the towering skyscrapers of modern urban life. And meanwhile, the entities are also looking for him. Oh, I like this.
Entity is plural? Because it seemed like there were so many false starts. I will say, this one kept me guessing.
Yeah, now it's worth noting this was originally published in a shorter form called The Pale Brown Thing. And it was the January-February issues of the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction in 77. And after this was published, he later said that the two texts should be regarded as the same story told at different times.
Yeah, and I saw that there was actually a released version of that, the Pale Brown Thing story, with some annotations comparing it to Our Lady of Sorrows that you can pick up. And very interesting to read that after reading Our Lady of Darkness. Sorry, yeah. A lot of ladies.
The minute these books were put together on the bed and made to resemble a human, referring to like the Lovecraft shoulder and all of that, I'm like, dude, you are playing with the wrong magic.
Well, and this gets so depressing because, so like Franz Weston, Lieber was recovering from having descended into alcoholism, but it's because his wife had passed away just a few years prior. So you've got that going on, and so the character having these books shaped like a woman next to him on the bed, kind of comforting, takes when you know how autobiographical it is. I mean,
yeah, I was surprised by that, like how much of this was his lived-in city and his lived-in life. You know, that was surprising to me that he got so close to himself with what a emotional story can be, especially the origins of it.
Well, yeah, I mean, he was living in the apartment that he wrote about.
Right.
The only, from my research, the only liberty he took with the building that he was living in is that he added a 7th floor to a 6-story building.
Now, if that's where he was living, I wonder what was actually found in the real janitor closet over there, as opposed to that book, right?
Well, if there was, right, but. A fan visited him in 1976 and said he was shocked to find him occupying one small room of a seedy San Francisco residence hotel its squalor relieved mainly by walls of books.
Mm.
And there's differing stories about, how poorly Lieber was doing. I mean, he was using a manual typewriter that he would set on the sink in his room to type. But, and matter of fact, Harlan Ellison went on a very lengthy rant about that. But also, it's said that that's because Lieber was taking his money and using it to go out and enjoy the town and dine. So it's really hard to say. But shortly after is when Lieber started getting money from TSR, and that kind of carried him through the rest of his life.
Now, Mark, I gotta say, when we opened on the city of San Francisco and talking about the hills and the Oakland and the Alameda areas, I could not help but think of, this is Vance's land.
Yeah,
Literally, this is where Vance lived. And so every single street that was mentioned with such detail, like it's so transformative, I think, from the writing of Lieber that we knew before. I mean, this is, the writing's on another level at this point.
It's interesting because the language is very rich, and obviously there's a lot of similarities between the kind of the vocabulary that's used in this and some of the Vancian vocabulary. The thing that threw me off so much was all the references, right? Because he is throwing out literary references, musical references, cultural references. And then encased in all that is this urban landscape that he is basically taking a street by street guidebook to, right? In many ways, he's not characterizing each street, but it's very much like, a Lankmar city map where he's saying, I'm going up this street, up, my way to the hill, and I take this transportation. And so it's very much like he is very detailed about that. It feels very urban, in this setting, and I think that's also something that, obviously kind of plays with his other works, his fantasy novels. But that was just, I think he was relatively new to San Francisco is what I understood. Like he'd been there maybe a few years, maybe less than that. And
yeah, I think
absorbed a lot of this because he'd come from, a different part of the country. And I think that was something he really dug into and took some ownership or care to present.
Well, and it's interesting that at least until COVID, there was actually a tour you could take in San Francisco that would take you to the various locations mentioned in this book.
That's our next team retreat, right?
I'm trying to remember because I saw photos of some of the locations and like the actual bookstore and things of that nature, and I found it absolutely fascinating, and just the way he ties everything in. I mean, Jen, you're talking about Jack Vance, right? There is the line. What was that epitaph Dorothy Sayers had seen on an old tombstone and thought the acme of all grew? I was like, okay, I only have one frame of reference for the word grew, and generally involves ending up with a headstone, not but yeah, this is considered one of Lieber's best novels. It is considered his most Lovecraftian novel, right? I mean, the hilltop of Corona Heights is really meant to evoke Lovecraft's Sentinel Hill from the Dunwich Horror.
And yes, yesterday he had lived through a story that might fittingly be called The Lurker at the Summit.
Yeah, and I was speaking to a Lovecraft expert out in Massachusetts, Franklin Hummel, and he mentioned that there is a fairly large number of people that believe that this story may have been the inspiration for the occult architecture of Ivo Shandor in Ghostbusters. So this story is just kind of rippled through so many things, and Warren Ellis has written stories that kind of tie into what is it called? Man, it's such a tough word too. Megalopolisomancy. Just yeah.
There's like Mega Necropolis. There's he's got a few words that he uses. Meganopolis Palaciomancy. Palaciomancy, maybe Palaciomancy.
Well, see, I think of Megapolis, and so maybe
Yeah, Megapalopolis.
yeah, it's
really
a
hard to say.
mouthful, is what it is.
And you all laughed at me for monochromaticity. Okay. Um,
and it's one of those things.
There's definitely that Lovecraft influence.
If I recall correctly, and I could be wrong, but I believe that Lieber was originally from the Chicago area. And if so, that sort of explains a bit of a throwaway line in the story where he mentions that someone, I forget the phrasing, but someone had dabbled with the Baha'i faith. And there's a massive Baha'i temple in Chicago. There's a very large Persian community because it's a religion that is from Iran and is not accepted there very well. And so, seeing things like that, and knowing that he really was living it on Geary Street, there's so many things. Weston's an amateur astronomer. Well, so is Lieber. It's this weird autobiographical tale where you're not really sure what is coming from truth and what isn't.
And there's even like references, like Stephen King too, because he's calling out his own work.
Yeah, he does. He like references like a story. What is it? A Bit of the Dark World. It's by Lieber. It's like one of those other references he just throws out there. So it's really interesting how he took that approach. But it turned out, like you said, Bob, this is I think it's a great novel. I think it's really a great story, and really enjoyed it, and genuinely creepy at different turns. Surprisingly so. I think and this was a story that sort of surprised you, maybe in how it turned out or how it progressed. But I just found myself like, especially the two instances when the brown thing appears in the window, even though I know it's coming, because it's so foreshadowed. It's just that when you get to that point, it's like you're drawn into that horror element, which is unusual, for reading a Lieber story for me.
I'm totally with you, that especially the second time when it's zooming through the binoculars towards him, that was great. And while most of the story is kind of a slow burn back and forth, it's got its peaks and valleys in pacing. When I got to the end, I was electrified during that entire last portion.
It does take that weird sort of literary turn when it's like, here's the freeze frame, snapshot of everybody's like what happened to them.
Yes,
which I found a very odd tonal difference between that and the rest of the story.
Because it wasn't an epilogue; it was an epilogue without being called such.
Right.
And
out of that first person voice that Franz was, having the whole time. So.
Well, the first time he sees that thing through his own window, when he goes out to Corona Heights and looks back, he sees the creature leaning through his own windows. So he's wondering, is this something dark? It has to be, and he was afraid to go back home. And he progressively finds some of the copies of his fantasy and sci-fi and horror pulps missing. And that explains the little bits of the brown paper. And so that actually really makes me think of the earlier title that you mentioned, Bob.
Yeah, the Pale Brown. Well, and just the way all of that comes together, and the revelation at the end that Our Lady of Darkness, the pale brown thing, is actually made up of shredded books and papyrus and ancient texts, and knows everything that's been written on all of these things. That was such a powerful turn as it's seeking to destroy him.
I will never again underestimate books that have gone missing.
No, not at all.
And those forlorn books that are left on your bed, maybe just take a little bit more caution to either clean them up or tuck them in a little bit.
Yeah, well, the whole concept of a scholar's wife, of gradually building a human body of books and magazines on your bed next to you, is something that I was not familiar with. And I joke that my to-read pile will someday fall and kill me, but
I think
that was very different.
Like a Dutch wife, or that phrase, which was something that, looking that up, was something in terms of like, it used to be a way for people to cool down in warm climates, having a wicker or bamboo basically pillow that you could hold on to get earth circulation. And that was that was kind of the analog that Franz, the author, was envisioning, but of course it turns out to this horror in the end.
And of course our villain, De Castries, scribbled this curse in a book that was suspected and later proven to be written by Clark Ashton Smith, a journal or diary.
Yeah, oh my God, yeah.
Stuck the pages together so they wouldn't easily be found, and that was the curse. But around the same time, Ambrose Pierce went missing. Jack London, George Sterling were dead. So I'm wondering, did he also curse them?
Well, and that's implied in the story, right? That he was responsible for their deaths. Yeah. And the fact that the villain of our story is actually dead, right? He's dead. He's been cremated. His ashes have been buried. Long before the story even starts, our villain is most certainly dead, but he still casts this incredibly long shadow.
The historian is kind of an accomplice, because he's the one that had gone out and spray painted all the sigils around, fairly basic symbols, really, around the burial site, which happened to be Corona Heights. And I love this passage that Franz perversely wondered what this graffiti would have done to the eerie rock-crowned hills in Lovecraft settings, like Whisper in Darkness, Village Horror, and so many literary call-outs that at one point it almost starts to feel lazy, like that's all they're doing. But at the same time, man, that takes a lot of research too.
Well, it's sort of like, and he calls out Dashiell Hammett, Arthur Machen, so many people, but in a way, it's Lieber in the 70s looking back at like the Lovecraft circle and some of those other folks that really kind of drove things and were inspirational, and tying it in, and tying like Lovecraft's description of Red Hook really is another example of the concept of a haunted city. And this idea of San Francisco is haunted and yet also paranormally charged, and so you can affect the future by affecting the city.
Well, and broader than that all cities have this, capacity, for paramentalism because of the structures. San Francisco just has to be at this sort of like apex of culture, and him coming to this kind of literary circle and using that to try to build a base of a cult to take this on. But also it's like evidenced by these like really kind of iconic things that are on the San Francisco skyline, like the tower, right? That keeps being referenced over and over again, or the
satellite,
or the Transamerica building, which obviously is like a very famous landmark at this time and still is. And so this kind of Lieber's coming to the San Francisco that has this very much a literary history, but it is also being confronted with the modernism, right? And I think that this story is a great sort of fabulistic way of exploring that, and this concept of this person who discovered the science of of that word, and
and Megalopolis-omancy.
And he's got this sort of like charm or charisma that almost works, right? But he's also confronted with these very much aloof or intellectual authors who are willing to deign sort of a passing fad, but they quickly tire of him and when it's not fun anymore, or there's not enough drinking or revelry.
Right. really does seem to be full of just little snippets of scenes.
Yeah.
Well, and in the chat, Hello Yes Toast was commenting that that it's like having a lot of people in one place creates a large well of psychic energy, but it really goes beyond that, because it's, as the city grows, it is forming its own sacred geometry. You know, because he starts getting into things like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn and Crowley. And so you've got all of these other things, and then these buildings and key points that finalize. Because, I mean, let's face it, you know, our villain wrote a curse, but the curse could not be completed until after his intended victim was dead, and that was because of the fact that the buildings had not been placed yet to complete the geometry for it.
Yeah, when I read that, that was like, woo, I love that.
Yeah, that was so cool. There's so much to recommend this story for. There's so many just brilliant concepts. There's moments of just horrid creepiness. There's weird dreamlike moments. There's this window into Lieber himself, and, you know, his recent battle with alcoholism, and just sort of the social circles he was in. I mean, you know, pot is a plaything, and, you know, and well, I don't want to smoke pot. Oh well, I've got cocaine. And those are very, very different things, but it was the casualness, and you wonder how much of that is of the fiction and how much of it is of Lieber.
Yeah.
Just brilliant. I'm really gonna have to hunt down some biographies of Lieber after this and really dig in.
Yeah, and I think it's a shame that the mention of all of the mental ward patients was kind of a throwaway in the story. I really would have liked to have did they did some of what they had experienced become more real now and more accepted by the characters in this little inner circle?
Yeah. Oh man.
Yeah. It's a lot to unpack. It's actually what was it?
I think it's safe to say we all enjoyed the book, though.
Yes,
yeah,
it's good.
Yeah, it was nice to sit and read a book that I've wanted to read more from Lieber for a long time.
It was really nice to read something other than the fantasy stories, you know, just because I had no idea, you know, that he was you know, that he'd written a horror novel first of all, or the one that was very autobiographical. You know, there is like, so you can see glimpses of like a Farford and Gray Mouser story. There's like one time when he's describing the mechanism at the top of the elevator shaft, and he's calling it this dwarf in this green armor, like a spider, you know, kind of creature. And that was very much like, oh, that could be lifted directly, you know, of a description of Langmar or these stories. But other than that, it's very much like a different, you know, different style in many ways, and it's kind of fun to see.
Well, and
I wonder if Margaret St. Clair was in the same circle, because there were so many points in the first couple of chapters that really read the same way.
She was up in the same area, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they obviously took little tips from each other. Like I said, this writing is far advanced from the Fawford and Gray Mouser stories, especially the ones from the 20s.
Well, and we
20s and 30s that came out.
We read a short story collection by Lieber not too long ago.
Horrible Imaginings.
And there was a story in there that this sort of reminded me of, where there's something unseen following the man through the city, and you don't really get a clear ending on that, but this had shades of that story, and it was just it was all greatly enjoyable.
But I think that's a pretty a pretty good synopsis. It was enjoyable, and I'm curious to read it again now, knowing what I know, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
I had the time.
Yeah, I think I'm really curious to read the original short story and look at it in those lights of like Lieber, you know, explaining it as told at different times, you know, because you know, that seems like it's intent. Well, you know, whether he did it intentionally or not, you know, and now he's got a perspective that both things are connected, and usually that doesn't happen with like a a serialized novel or stories that stories
Right.
novel. It's usually like, ignore those. This is what I the time and space to do. So
And said this is the time he told it down at the bar, and this is the time that he told it at the party.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, really. Now there was a quote that I wanted to throw out there that De Quincey had intended to write a whole book about Our Lady of Darkness and call it The Kingdom of Darkness, but apparently never had. What happened to De Quincey? What happened to his Lady of Darkness?
Well, that's a good question, right?
I am so distrustful of random stacks of books now, man.
Oh boy, you're in for a very.
I'm in the wrong house for that.
You are in the wrong house. Yeah, you really are. At least now it's boxes of it's stacked boxes of random books. No, it's random. It's stacks of random boxes of books because the books within the boxes aren't random. Yeah. Okay. This is hurting my head. Can we move on to things to stacked?
Sure.
Sure. What you got, Bob?
Well, so he describes a real drug, paraldehyde, when he's talking about the mental patients at the beginning.
Yeah.
And the invisible nurse who ended up killing the entire ward.
Oh, that was Saul's story. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a real medication. It has a very strong smell, and he described it as like this super aromatic, super alcohol, super banana oil gasoline that's served in a shot glass because it'll melt plastic and its molecules travel through the air ahead of it faster than light. And I was like, oh, this is definitely. There's definitely a potion in here, right? I mean, it needs to be in a glass because if you put it in like a drinking horn, it'll melt through the horn. And the idea of a scent traveling faster than light, I like. There's got to be there's a potion there somewhere, right? I mean, it's a real drug. There's a potion in there somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
Then there was the description of screaming lightning, where he once heard lightning over Chicago. It wasn't thunder, but this high-pitched moaning scream. And I thought that would make a great mercurial effect.
That's
right?
Awesome
Screaming
idea, yeah.
lightning. Just there's these moments where he's running through the city and he keeps feeling that he's being pursued, and sometimes it's like, well, maybe it's the dogs from the hill, but then in his mind the dogs were becoming spiders, and he talks to someone else who had a dream of dog-sized creamy furred spiders hunting them, and the way they kept to the shadows as they were following them, I think the spiders they beg to be written up.
He makes references to the breed of dog called a bourgeois? Yeah, and it's like it is kind of this sort of like has hanging fur that sort of drapes down and like kind of sweeps the ground a little. It's like a tall dog, but with that description you're saying, it could be, I can see that spider image coming in the dark.
Right, it was just so creepy. Then when our villain, they talk about he had created his own sort of response to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, the Hermetic Order of the Onyx Dusk, which also made me think of the Hermetic Order of the Silver Twilight out of Call of Cthulhu. Mm-hmm. It made me think, that in DCC we have these orders of knighthood and things of that nature. And in Dying Earth, there's organizations for magicians. Well, maybe, wizardry collegiums in straight DCC should be a thing, right? The order, take out Hermetic and just leave it as the Order of the Onyx Dusk. Little things like that. I mean, he mentions the Crystal Skull, although he mentions it as having been debunked by a friend of his. Mm-hmm. I think we can all talk about the Queen of Night, so I'll leave that to you two. But he also talks about like fringe matters of the occult, and there was a few things on there that I thought would be kind of cool to write up. Writing up rules for dowsing, or writing up rules for reading auras. solid stuff. There's a line in the book, "Ghosts are we, but with skeletons of steel." And that is evocative enough, I think, to stat something up. And then obviously, why shouldn't a modern city have its special ghosts like castles and graveyards and big old manor houses, right? I mean, megalopolisomancy needs to be a thing. So that's kind of where I'm at. There was so much in this I wanted to write up and start playing with.
I think all modern cities should have ghosts. They're a civilizing influence.
Oh, yeah. What about you, Mark?
The big obvious one for me was new curses, especially the example of the cipher curse that he wrote in Smith's journal, given this kind of like, it requires these other elements to be present that aren't there yet. It has this sort of like fate kind of quality because this journal somehow ends up in Franz's hands, and he lives in the same apartment, where, so all these things had to like sort of like come together. So there's a sense of even outside the curse itself, that has the power is being pulled and tugged in various directions. But yeah, I thought, just ideas for curses would be great, especially if you can make them a little bit more like the cipher one. The witchcraft.
You love your ciphers.
Yeah. The witchcraft in the walls is this great idea and very evocative because it's this actual literal book in the wall, and this thing that is having this influence around. It kind of reminded me of reading about, I think in Roman times, there would be a very common practice of writing a curse on a lead tablet and then having somebody throw it on the roof of the intended curse victim, right? So this is something that, people would pay for this service. And that idea that you could pay for somebody to like write a book and put it in the wall that has, their victim or intended victim was kind of an interesting concept. The brown thing, I immediately went to like a spell, some sort of DCC spell that has various results, based on, the required materials and whatever materials you choose to use, whether you use paper, parchment, pulp that up, or you use some other sort of wizardly, paraphernalia. I think that's kind of a neat idea of just creating this, this object out of whatever book or thing, experimental materials you have. I like that, and a spell would be good, something to stat out. The binoculars that can see in the past, which is very evocative. Another one of these sort of things where he's looking and he's sort of like thinking back to the story by, I think, Henry James. It was A View from a Hill, and saying that binocular had been magicked essentially to view things in the past because it had this sort of ground up bones that had been liquefied, and when the binoculars broke, the liquid oozed out and they lost, that they could see it losing its power, that sort of thing. I love that image of like filling an object with this kind of narcoleptic or like this kind of like necropsy of elements to make it an occult object.
Yeah.
And then because of the way the story ends, I was thinking, what, some type of cleric that can turn unholy using science? Which I thought was
dark heresy.
Yeah.
Well, not just science, right? But I mean, she called on like 3 composers,
creators.
That's right. It's creationist, I guess, and it was it was like something she inherited from her father, which makes me want to like be that kind of dad now.
Oh, I could totally see that.
But yeah, those are things that just came to mind. It's weird to set up something from a more traditional horror story rather than a usual fantasy story, but it was kind of a fun exercise. What about you, Jen?
Well, Bob, speaking of your skeletons of steel, I was thinking building sentient beings, these gargantuan tombs or monstrous vertical coffins would actually be kind of a cool thing.
Like the lady that claimed the buildings were following her down the street at night.
How do you know they weren't?
Well, I was just saying, for example.
Mark, I'm right there with you with the curses, especially using the toffee rhyme. Went to Toffee's house, but he was at mine, and yeah,
that's great.
there's a lot of importance in DCC placed on the symbols that you find, and usually they're like this weird upside down Z, you know, from Mr. Codex. The simple signs, or the simple anti-hex signs. Who would have thought a single 5-pointed star was actually keeping away dark forces? And as it turned out, was pretty easy to get rid of. But just that simple little thing, I mean, I could totally see adventuring, coming across a small village, and those are the symbols that they use because that's what keeps them safe, they think.
There was, yeah, I think he also
referenced something
like
like MCC for that, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mark.
I was gonna say he also referenced. I think it was a paragraph where he was talking about the sort of like 3 things that bears, or the author they wanted to go speak to. There was like the silver figurines that was supposed to prevent the paramentals, and then there was the abstract designs, you know, which reminded me of like vampires having to like pick up or like count sand or things like that. And then the last was that 5-pointed star essentially, which, like you said, super simple and easy. And
well, and it wasn't even that it was easy to get rid of, because I mean, it was the 5-pointed star. The idea being, if something tried to enter, it would get snagged on the point of the star.
Yeah.
But the problem was, it was already inside when they put up all the stars. They just didn't know it. It's not that it was easy to get rid of. It was just that, you know, he trapped it in there with him. It's not that you know, I'm trapped in here with you. It's you're trapped in here with me. It's literally what happened.
Yeah, and our Peruvian groundskeeper Fernando is absolutely a shaman dealing with things like this. He was the one who kept saying, you know, there's definitely the witchcraft in the walls.
Yeah.
I am not going to stat the girls in blue dresses because they're creepy red herrings on their own, and I would totally insert them into whatever I'm running just to throw people off their game. Could we maybe have something, Mark, like you mentioned, hereditary powers for PCs? Like DeCastries was descended from the decipherer of the Rosetta Stone. So
yeah,
he
that's
had
a
a leg
cool
up
idea.
on all of these languages.
That's it. That you could, you could almost like build that into the funnel experience, right? You could have I mean, if you wanted to like have it sort of like be part of this easy, simple character creation. But yeah, I like that.
Well, and that sort of ties into
right?
Well,
Sorry.
but the hereditary powers kind of ties into the fact there's a lot of Jungian psychology throughout this entire story, and you know, and symbolism and things of that nature. And so when you start getting into ancestral memory, which is a similar concept that derives from there, and just taking it that step further to hereditary powers, you know, the Iris, the 7th son of the 7th son, and things of that nature. I could totally see doing that.
Yeah, that could possibly be started up as a spell to dive into your ancestral memories,
or maybe just as a character background. I mean, God, you could do a lot with it. That's really good.
Lankmar Benisons.
That's really cool.
Without having to, you know, go into and choose what background you want for your characters, because DCC doesn't work like that.
Yeah.
And there was, Bob mentioned the Order of the Onyx Dusk. There was a ring that DeCastries wore that went along with it, and there's a beautiful long description in the story on that, and that is absolutely a magic item. It was buried with him too.
Yeah.
Or sealed in wax next to or glued to the top of his urn. Yeah. So that's definitely a ring of power. I think that's it for my fun little list here. As for audio suggestions, I'll just barrel right in because I was listening to Django Reinhardt, listening to the old Belgium, I believe, Belgium or Bulgarian, I forget. just listening to the old jazz mixes, especially during those walks down the streets of San Francisco, during this weird time of all of the towers starting to become built. Yeah, that's me. Take it away, guys.
I'll do the short one next. The one thing that kept running through my mind because of all the of Cal, who's his neighbor downstairs, but she also is the one that saves him in the end. She was a musician doing a practice for the concerto, and when I was younger, it kind of bolted with me out of the blue that I used to love and adore the Wendy Carlos Moog synthesizer compositions of the Bach concertos, and there was like Switched on Bach and Switched on Bach 2 and the Well-Tempered synthesizer, and it just like I hadn't listened to those in years, and it was like one of the things that I spent a lot of time listening to just because it was just a fun thing I loved when I was a younger kid. But they, that just it kind of fits in that classical music theme that's a big part of the story, and obviously has an element, like you mentioned, that the visitation to the psych ward is punctuated by this expression of music, which calms everybody down, and that obviously foreshadows what happens later with the concerto being this sort of resonating thing that but triggers his Franz's go back to and solve this riddle, and her knowing that by solving this riddle he was going to be in danger, right? Which was this kind of like lovely thing that wasn't. It's sort of like the anti-magic, right? It's like it's music and science sort of fitting into an antidote to the occult. So
Cal was named for Calpurnia, who was the character who continually she kept warning Caesar.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Well, and of course
she played the harpsichord of all things.
Megapolis Amansi is referred to by its creator, at least, as a science as opposed to something paranormal. So there's that.
I was going to say, just recommend if you can pick up a copy of Wendy Carlos. I tried today to see if I could download them, but they're not available for digital download. You have to buy the CD or the go to Wendy Carlos's site, and I think you can purchase directly from there. But that was just a fun sort of like blast from the past. What about you, Bob?
Well, first of all, I should say that so because of everything that's been going on, the main Spotify playlist is still under construction. Although I was able to find the first Switched on Bach album on Spotify, so that is on the playlist. I really kind of struggled while I was reading this. I was trying to find music to listen to help kind of calm my mind and set the mood, and I tried a lot of kind of my go-to spooky stuff, and none of it really fit. And finally, I hit upon a playlist of all things. It was the playlist for the queue of the Tower of Terror. So it's things like Pyramid by Johnny Hodges and Deep Purple by Turner Layton. It's got Vera Lynn, Sidney Bechet, Rex Stewart, Duke Ellington. And because the story is set in 77, but it keeps referring back to the 20s and the 30s, it just had this really great ghostly feel. And, Fats Waller, Henry Allen, Glenn Miller, Bunny Berrigan. So I've been working on assembling those songs as well for the playlist, because for me, it really set the mood of the haunted streets in the 70s, because it's the ghosts of the past. And it's just there's nothing like sitting and listening to Delta Mood by Rex Stewart or Remember by Red Norvo. The stuff was great, and that was. I mean, I've got a long list, and I'll post my full list when we post the show, but you can just go to YouTube and you can just search for Tower of Terror playlist, and you'll find it. And for me, that was perfect. That was it.
My favorite part was probably walking in as you were finishing the book with that song, with the playlist going, and you were actually bothered.
Yeah. Oh no,
By
no.
the ending.
The end. When you get to the end of the story before that little epilogue, it's creepy and it's kind of intense, and
Yeah.
it has those visceral moments, and the music just heightened the entire experience for me. It was perfect. So Mark, tell us about the word of the day.
Sometimes the story has so many you just can't select one. There are. I mean, this is like we talked about. It's a very sort of rich vocabulary book that every once in a while I'd go, oh, well, that's a new one. I need to go and look that up later, or kind of like take note of it. There's also just a lot of like what I'd say great sounding words. There's deliquesce, right, which is this process of becoming a liquid during decomposition, and that was one. So he used it somewhere in I think one of the later ones, and probably one of the literary references. Just saying this is something that somebody else used. Sibiratically, which means voluptuously, and he's describing in that case like the ornamentation of his author friend Bears's room, who leads what clearly like a decadent lifestyle. Ragoose, this is kind of another word that I really like. Gru, the word that sort of threw me off too, because I was like, oh, what is the definition for that? And it's this kind of creeping sense of horror, and I think that reference was all about that being sort of the epitome of the creeping sense of horror.
That still fits Vance. Just saying.
He had a lot of like just on his science. The one word that really stood out to me was the mega necropolis. This just sort of this evocative of this like huge city of undead. And then Jen, you pointed out a couple that I'd missed. Which I loved after going back, because I think you could probably find a word every few pages that would just call out to it. My favorite, I think, that I would nominate is gimcrack, which is something that's flimsy or poorly made, but deceptively attractive. And I love
like that. IKEA furniture.
Yeah. that gimcrack, IKEA furniture, just like that.
Harsh.
Yeah, but it's definitely a fun novel for that.
Yeah.
There was one that actually made me stop and look it up before I could continue, and I mean that's a Harley stroke trick, right? One word in all of his modules, he tries to give one that you're gonna have to stop and look up, and this one was coin, but it's COIGN, and it's a projecting corner or angle of a wall or building.
Mm-hmm. Apparently used in Shakespearean plays, right? This is when you put that there, I was like, oh, that's a really cool word too. Yeah. How about we go on to existing DCC inspirations and reskins? What did this make you think of, Jen?
I was going to have Bob start this one.
Oh, cool. Okay.
Okay.
We have a couple that overlap. So,
well, first of all, Forging the Ghost Ring sprang to mind, because as you're bouncing in and out of the city, and there's all sorts of supernatural elements involved, or I guess making of the Ghost Ring. That's it, making the Ghost Ring. I think that would be most of the stuff that I was thinking of was all tied into, man, and I had it earlier. Megalopolisomancy. There we go. So stuff with things with big cities, right? So Ghost Ring is Punjar. Anything from like Metal Gods of Ur-Hadad, the zine, right? Ur-Hadad, which is this massive twisting city, certainly would have its own sacred geometry and symbolisms built in. Lankmar, I will leave for Jen, because I know she's chomping at the bit to talk about Lankmar. Because she is still selling those box sets. In the first editions are sold out, but she will still sell you one if she finds one. But I also thought that the whole concept of Megalopolisomancy, got it, would be a great addition for Weird Frontiers, in that certainly not out in the frontier towns, but if you're heading back to like Chicago or New York, if you're heading back east into these big cities, and the cities are watching you, and the story discussed the significance of diagonal streets, because that's how the devil looks into cities, is through the diagonal streets. So those sorts of stories I thought would be great to overlay with bits and pieces or those adventures would be great to overlay with bits and pieces from this story, because they just scream for the creepy expansion, just to ratchet them up a couple of notches. So now what about you, Jen?
Well, yeah, the city of Lankmar, of course, it's Lieber, right? And in this one, he writes, each block is a surreal cenotaph that would bury Dolly. Yeah, familiar with quite a few Salvador Dali pieces. Okay, I'll take that, especially for San Francisco. That I could see the corollary there, especially with the coastline all along the western edge, and yeah, maybe Lankmar really is built on the bones of a really old Drake era San Francisco. Tower of the Black Pearl, Mark, you mentioned earlier like Book of Names, and like the next one written would be the one to be snuffed out. And so you have the Book of Candle, or the Book of Names, and the correlating candles, and that scene really kind of struck a nerve there. I feel like I would be remiss if I did not give a shout out to our known Lovecraftian works in the quote unquote stable. We've got, of course, Daniel Bishop's
Creep Creep? No, it's not.
No, Arkham the R Witch Grinder.
The Witch Grinder, that's right, yes.
I almost forgot it. I'm like, oh no. And from the Crawl Thulu zine, issue 1, A Horrible Day at the Dunwich Fair. And it is, yeah, it would fit thematically, but it takes place in a very rural setting, so that's not really gonna work. The last thing I wanted to throw out a nod to that exists already, if anybody is on Michael Curtis's Patreon page before he shuts it down, or I'm not sure if he has already, back in 2020 he started a little thing on Zoom for everyone. We had 3 factions based on alignments, and it was called War Crawl.
Rub it in, why don't you, Jen? Rub it in.
Team Law may have won. One of the items that stuck with me so much afterwards was this armor that seemed to be sheets of music. But we weren't sure if it was just lyrics or were there really music stabs in there. Turned out it didn't matter, but it is an item that he has written up and is available to the Patreon supporters called Literate Armor, and it is one of my favorite things ever.
Ooh, that sounds cool.
Awesome.
What about you, Mark?
I thought a lot about Shutter Mountains when I was reading this, and another Michael Curtis creation, because there are so many ghost stories in the setting, especially some of the precursor adventures to the Chain Coffin. Very much of a horror / creepy feeling and vibe, and so that's a setting I think you could easily sort of take elements from Lieber's book and insert them here. The creepy pulp creature that's haunting the local Shutter Mountain area. I thought also Bride of the Black Manse more because of the horror element that's part of being locked in the house and having to solve it within a certain amount of time, and the pulse pounding that happens at the end.
And the factor of the possibly inherited lineage.
Mm-hmm. The one of the references that he talked about in the book is Piazzi Smith, who is very much like he's a royal astronomer, I think, and he was also really into pyramids, and especially the Great Pyramid. And historically, he had went on this expedition that was financed, not by the Royal Society, but by a private financier. And the purpose of it was to measure the Great Pyramid in exacting detail and have even the internal tunnel networks and things like that. And I just like that idea of like overlaying that onto some ziggurat-based adventure where it's been built to these precise elements, and it creates this own sort of occult power to it. But also the idea that within the ziggurat there is a dungeon funereal cenotaph, if you want. So the other things that are not really directly DCC related, but a couple of things I wanted to call out was I saw in my reading there was this RPG that was referenced called Cult RPG, which apparently is originally published in Sweden, or it's a Swedish RPG that has an English version now, but it's very much of this idea of cities having two realities to them, right? And maybe we want to go and investigate that role-playing system. The other thing I thought it was, and I've only played this a few times, but is Mage the Ascension, this idea that your characters have this sort of ability to alter the world and the people around them are called sleepers, or the sleeping, or something like that. But that sort of idea of paramentalism and the cities and being able to like sort of affect the real world, and it's overlaid with the real world. That was a fun part of that role-playing system that I think you could do something similar in a DCC setting. How is it that these individuals, like, they have hereditary, or they just have maybe the world is changing around them and they're being haunted, but that idea of paramentalism and how it changes the urban landscape is a fun one. So
that's really cool. I hadn't stopped to think about it, because it's a very World of Darkness thing, right? I mean, in like Werewolf the Apocalypse, there's the Umbra, and electricity is the spirits and things like that. So yeah, no, I totally see that. That's really cool.
I was going to say we could just chalk it up to the entire World of Darkness there. That is really, really cool. Thank you for thinking outside the box. I like that. All right, so we're going to move from the Order of the Onyx Dusk, and this brings us to our featured DCC tie-in for the show, which is the Veiled Vaults of the Onyx Queen by Marzio. Mascara. No, help! I hate butchering his last name. He's such a good guy. I'm sorry. So Marzio wrote this one. The last name looks like Muscadere, but I know that's not how it's pronounced. Okay, enough about that. Bob, tell us about this.
The Queen's Onyx Jubilee is set to begin, marking the 95th year of the merciful monarch's glorious reign. While the entire realm celebrates the good fortune of their long-lived sovereign, a group of common villagers fights to stay alive. For them, the festivities have become a nightmare, as the sounds of revelry are replaced by screams of terror, their own. Imprisoned by opulence, marked for death, hunted by creatures both grotesque and foul, this ragtag group of unsuspecting villagers must band together to brave the vile mysteries that haunt this place and stand defiant in the face of death itself, if they hope to escape the veiled vaults of the Onyx Queen and save their very souls. It's a zero-level adventure, starts in media res, with the characters awakening deep within an opulent palace where they are set to become unwitting sacrifices to the corpse god Mordigian. There they must piece together their clues as to their whereabouts, contend with the ghoulish death cult, stop a vile sacrament, close a gate to the underworld, and ultimately confront the corpse god himself if they want to escape the charnel palace and save their very souls.
Funnel? Wow.
Yeah.
Hmm. Oh, I know a module we need to feature somewhere else too. Okay.
Oh man, and it's a great adventure. It's worth it just for the sacristy search table. It really is.
It's really fun. I haven't had a chance to play this one, but reading it Marzio, I love his work, but this was something that I hadn't read before, and really enjoyed just the breadth of all the encounter space that you have with this adventure. So as a judge, you have this sort of tour of a mausoleum, that has various mini encounters in it, and
Yeah.
you can see how easily there may be parties that are players that miss that entirely. They just go directly to the end thing, but with this sort of like meandering quality to it was really nice. I really liked it.
Well, there's just, I mean, so the tables in the adventure make it a lot of fun, but tying it to this story, Our Lady of Darkness, the phantom voices that call out and then sort of fade away. And Thibaut de Castries as the philosopher king, right? I mean, he is the philosopher king of this story. There's no doubt.
Yeah.
And then when you get to that portion of the adventure, there's the wonderful table for the philosopher king's alphabet. All sorts of really, I mean, there's so many really neat little pieces that are just crammed to overflowing with really cool stuff, between just the text and the monsters.
And he's got like some neat results for like reinventing your zero level, right? There's some things you can do in the adventure to not only re-roll your starting luck, but you can re-roll your occupation, and you can re-roll your stats to a certain extent, because he has that for a few places, and it's really concise and just kind of a fun way for getting out of the normal funnel lane. So
yeah. It is Marzio Mushedra. Sorry. And I have to say, Marzio's writing style really lends itself to this. I've gotten to work on a few of his things, and Lieber and Clark Ashton Smith are obviously some of his favorites, and Lovecraft as well. But you can see the Smith references throughout here. As Bob mentioned, de Castries is plain as day. So I would actually recommend both this module and this story for anyone who's a fan of Clark Ashton Smith who might not have thought to give this one a look.
It's also an excuse for Jen to buy, purple fountain pen ink.
I mean, that did come to mind, but I'm way ahead of you on that. I mean, of all of the things to unpack, of course, some of my pens, yes.
But the other thing I think that really sticks out to me in this adventure is it's a funnel, but it's a funnel where those zero levels get to face off against a true big bad, right? Yeah. I mean, they're facing off against the charnel god, or at least the avatar of. I mean, there's big stakes for a zero level character. It's not just, whoops, a goblin threw a spear, hit me in the chest, I'm dead. There's the equivalent of that as well. I mean, it is a funnel, but there's big stakes. It's not just, well, these are zero level, they've only got a handful of hit points, so you can't throw anything serious at them. Marzio finds a way to do that and really make it work.
Do not let it be said that all zero level funnels are boring, or that any.
Yeah, I've never found anything boring.
Yeah.
No, there's a lot of people who don't yet play DCC, and the funnel is one of the things they have a problem with. So this throws so much at them that can be surmounted if your dice agree with you, or.
Well, and I guess, I mean, we could, I think theoretically, I mean, DCC's been around for 10 years now. I mean, I think we could safely say that your DCC 100 starts kind of the current modern DCC era. So this would be the first funnel of the modern DCC era. And it is, I think, in many ways, almost as iconic as Sailors, just because there's so many really cool twists and turns to it. It is a brilliantly written adventure. And I think that people that play it are going to talk about it a lot.
Yeah, I think it's rare that funnels are these things that are, like you said, outside the DC community, maybe like a little bit looked on like, oh, I don't know, that sounds sort of weird, but this is like one of those adventures that really proves how creative you can get with this idea of zero level characters. And it's also a great hook for further adventures, right? This is something that at the end of the tale there is a hint of, well, that may not be everything that's down there, and this sort of, all the players are invested in, is there yet more things to root out or discover, or more tombs that might, view them with some treasure or some magic item, because there's also a lot of that scattered around too, which is unusual for kind of like that zero level as well. So
I think it ends perfectly with the adventure equivalent of, and that story will also be told. Right? I mean,
yeah.
Nice.
Definitely, if you're a DCC fan and you have these kind of like, I always go back to Sailors and just run that for new groups, things like that, this is an excellent adventure to branch out of that and just use this. I'm going to try it out, just because it's one of the things that.
If only there was a place like next week that a lot of people could get it.
Well, and I think that if you're new to DCC, this is a great funnel to run. If you've been running DCC forever, well, then your group has been through Sailors at least once, and if you're starting a new campaign, you need a new funnel anyway. I think this is it. It is absolutely brilliant.
All right, Bob. So do we have a couple other things we need to talk about real quick?
We have relaunched the Sanctum Secorum Companion as the Sanctum Secorum Quarterly. As always, it's available for free on DriveThruRPG, and we are always looking for more content and more contributors. So if you're interested in joining the team for the long haul, or just having something for a single issue, you can drop us a line at thehub@sanctum.media. We'd love to see what sort of stuff you're coming up with. Our first issue is available, although our second issue has been delayed due to the relocation of the Sanctum Library. That has caused a few delays. In the meantime, you can also be sure to look for the first hard copy release by Ugandan author Ashraf Braden, debuting at Gen Con. It's going to be available at the Goodman Games booth, and I'll likely have copies with me in the evenings. It is a compilation of the releases with expanded material and an intro by Ashraf, and it will only be available at Gen Con, so look for that. And then his next release, because again, the relocation of the Sanctum Library threw a few things up.
Behogo is coming. It ties back to the Bachwezi, and the Behogo is coming.
Well, yes, the Behogo is coming. That ties back to the Bachwezi. And I've read it. It's great.
Pronunciation guides, Bachwezi.
Yeah, if you're enjoying the show, please comment on the podcast or help us by posting a review on iTunes or YouTube, right? Or DriveThruRPG if you're one of our zine fans. The ratings and reviews really do help. I mean, it sounds funny because everybody is always saying, click subscribe and hit the bell. But those things really do make a difference. It helps new people find the podcast. It helps people find our community. So there's that. And then next month, which is a lot sooner than I like to think about, we have a special pre-recorded episode, which is going straight to podcast. So the Sanctum Secorum will not be on Twitch next month, but we will be discussing Tanith Lee's Knight's Dark Master with super special guest James V. West. So that's kind of our news, Jen.
All right. And with that, don't forget to hunt each of us down individually at Gen Con in Indianapolis. We will be there for, I don't know, at least a week. The scheduling's kind of This week we're there. This other week we might. I don't even know anymore. So I think officially we start on August 3rd is when it opens to the public. So come say hi to us. Get a bookmark from us if we happen to have any on us. If not, we'll give you a handwritten rain check on a Post-it note. We're official and stuff, right?
That's right.
So I'm honored to be here with my two co-hosts, and this has been a wonderful episode, a wonderful book to read, and a great module to tie it all together. So I think that'll probably take us out.
Mark, any last thoughts?
I really enjoyed the selection. I think, Jen, if like you said, we had read this 6 months ago, we would have had a tour that we would have immediately booked, a self-guided tour for that advanced visit of San Francisco. Really enjoyed it, and I had so much fun talking with you guys about it. And also looking forward to seeing folks next week. So if you happen to be in the Indianapolis area for Gen Con, looking forward to saying hi and just having a lot of fun with games.
And I will second and third. I'm looking forward to seeing people next week at Gen Con. That's the highlight of the convention for me, really, of any convention, is seeing members of the community. So
one quick thing, if you are going to Gen Con, please hydrate now for next week and take care of yourselves, stay healthy. Gen Con can be pretty grueling, so go into it healthy to begin with.
Yeah, there you have it.
And yeah, and yes, even you, Great Babe.
And so with that, thanks for listening, and be inspired.
Good night.